All right, so here we're going to talk about Nubia. And Nubia is this region of the Upper Nile. This is this cataract here. This cataract, again, is this sort of periods of rapids um, that distinguished or delineated Egypt and Egyptian society from this other kingdom that existed in sort of the Upper Nile here of Nubia. And if you're talking Egypt, you sort of have to talk about Nubia because there were neighboring kingdoms. They were constantly in contact back and forth at some points. And, sometimes they were kind of worked independently. Sometimes Egypt invaded areas of Nubia. Other times Nubia invaded areas of Egypt. But you can see there was a lot of cross-cultural interactions here. There's Nubia developed their own pyramid building structure for their kings, for their rulers. So there's we find evidence of Egyptian gods in Nubia as well. They also practiced agriculture along along the Nile River. So there's a lot of contact between them. But what Nubia really did is it functioned as sort of the midpoint between all of sub-Saharan Africa and other areas, branches of the Nile River, as a conduit of trade and connections into Egypt. And there was a lot of trade going back and forth. Sub-Saharan Africa has so many resources: gold, iron, ivory, animal skins, animals themselves, all of this stuff. Anything that came from sub-Saharan Africa, a large majority of it came through what is now Nubia. So kind of give you an idea of where it was. But it was definitely distinctive. Here you can see, obviously, the pyramids of Nubia are smaller, but there's actually more pyramids in Nubia than there were built in Egypt. So a lot of connections between them. Here's some examples of Nubian statues. So you can see, again, sort of they are Egyptian, look Egyptian, but they definitely have their own Nubian looks to them as well. And here you can kind of see they were founded in 2500 BCE. They have different capitals over time, Napata, Meroe, as different kingdoms and rulers emerged. About 1000 BCE, they did invade Egypt, and the last Nubian king, King Kashta, conquered Egypt in 760 BCE. And this is actually the end. A lot of people look at this as the end of traditional Egypt, because after the kingdom of Kush and under King Kashta invaded and defeated Egypt, which ended the new kingdom. The people who came in and defeated the Nubian rulers were the Greeks. So this was sort of the beginning of the end of traditional sort of pharaonic Egypt and these new rulers of there. So you can see the connections there. We see a lot of Nubians in Egyptian hieroglyphs. They're always predominantly a lot darker. So this is sort of the sub-Saharan African complexion and genetics as well. Definitely different faces than Egyptians. They were known as much different. But here you can kind of see in the processions of things they brought. They brought a lot of cattle. There's a lot of in sort of Eastern Africa is where a lot of cattle were herded. So they brought a lot of cattle up there. Here you can kind of see these ringlets of gold as well. These plates of gold. So they're known for their gold. They would trade with sub-Saharan Africa. Iron, gems, jewels. So you can kind of see a lot of as they're depicted here, and from the Egyptian perspective, very rich groups, but also very distinct. And they would trade with Egypt. Egypt was very known for textiles, pottery, grain, honey, finished goods. So a lot of things coming out of Egypt were part of these trade networks, greater trade networks. So Nubia, they were a own kingdom, but they were very much tied into these larger trade networks, and then Egypt itself was tied into these larger trade networks. So you can see the interconnectionness of trade in the ancient world via these different civilizations. The one thing is we don't really know as much about Nubian society as we do about Egypt. One, we don't have as much artifacts there. We do have, obviously these temple sites, and we have, artifacts of kings. We know a little bit about their religion. There was this god Apadamik. He was a creator god. Sibamekor we have a lot of Egyptian deities. They did have their own writing, Muriotic. but it's not been fully translated yet. There's a little bit, some of it comes up. There's some a couple things and connections with hieroglyphs, but there's not. We don't really know, and we don't have again. We don't have as much records of Nubian records as we do of Egyptian records. We assume their social status was kind of similar to Egypt and religion as well, that they had sort of a hierarchical structure with the kings and scribes and priests. They had their own deities, but they also borrowed a lot of Egyptian deities. So there was this other whole Nubian kingdom there that as well as now is what sort of Ethiopia and Sudan. And this was very sort of connected Egypt with sub-Saharan Africa.